Hey, it's Clay. Welcome to another video. Today I wanted to address in more of a detailed explanation my advice that I would give to somebody that is a beginner looking to get into tube amps. Whether you want to build, modify, tinker with them, we're talking guitar amps, bass amps, hi-fi amps, anything that's related to tubes and high voltage and amplifiers in that world. How would somebody get started doing that? This will be my advice to you. So if you're curious about that, let's go ahead and dive in. All right, for a little context, I'm coming at this pretty much solely from a guitar amp perspective, but I do think a lot of this could apply to whether you want to get into it for bass or hi-fi or other reasons. But again, for me, it's all going to be about guitar amps. Now, really, the first thing we talk about when it comes with tube amps is safety. Safety has to be the number one concern, has to start and end there, because there can be potentially dangerous or even lethal high voltage, high current systems going on here that you're going to be dealing with tube amps. So you have to know how to interact with that safely. And that warning is very severe, very serious. You need to take it safely, and you need to be thinking about it every time that you're interacting with a tube amp. Fundamentally, I look at this very similar to if you were learning to drive a motorcycle or operate a chainsaw or any other type of activity or hobby that somebody could get into that does have a potential dangerous risk to it. You really need to make sure that you become educated and trained and that you are aware and you've built up a certain level of knowledge and you have the tools and practice in order to operate it safely. With tube amps, I think that presents a little bit of a unique problem because there just isn't a lot of training that goes along with those kinds of things. If you think about a lot of other dangerous types of activities, usually there's pretty good training that goes along with it. Even something as basic as swimming can be very dangerous for a person that doesn't know how to swim if they fall into a deep body of water. But if you think about it, all of my kids at least go through swimming lessons. Driving a car can be a very dangerous activity. Driving a very 1,000-pound object at up to 70 miles per hour, you can cause a lot of injury and even death. But again, we have driver's education classes that go along with that. So the level of training needs to really match the level of dangerousness. And with tube amps, that's just challenging. So even though I'm trying to convey this to you through a YouTube video, there is definitely some shortcoming and some challenge there. So some of this is going to be on you taking that process after watching this video to continue to educate yourself and train yourself so that you know what to do and how to do it. And that can be a challenge just because there aren't a lot of people that tinker with guitar amps in the world really anymore. It's kind of a niche occupation or hobby to be into. So all that to be said, we really do need to start with safety. Now, when thinking about safety, there's really a couple of key things that I want to impress upon you. Again, high current, high voltage systems exist in these tube amps. And really there's a couple things to note. Number one, when you always need to assume that the amp is live or plugged in until you confirm otherwise. So you need to give it that certain level of respect. It's kind of like operating a gun where you need to assume that it's loaded until you've confirmed otherwise. So always need to make sure that the power cord is unplugged. Step number two is you really need to make sure that the filter caps are discharged. In a tube amp, capacitors act like a reservoir. They're capable of storing voltage, holding onto it, and releasing it in a way that we want, and we use that for our purposes for lots of different things. There's lots of capacitors that fulfill a lot of different functions in a guitar amp circuit. The filter caps exist in the power supply. They help take the 120 volts that comes from the wall as an AC or alternating current signal, and it gets rectified into a direct current signal, but it's still a little bit choppy and wavy, and it would add some hum or buzz to the circuit. So we subject that voltage to a filtering circuit to help smooth it out, to make that ripple smoother and smoother and smoother so that it's as quiet as possible. So part of that process is to store that voltage and help it level out. And so those filter caps can store a voltage inside of them even after the amp is turned off and unplugged. And you should never assume that the filter caps have discharged their voltage until you confirm otherwise. So how do we do that? Really, there's two main ways that you can do it, but this is a topic, again, that you should do a deeper dive into. Okay, on my workbench here, I have the two tools that you primarily will use in order to make sure that your amp is safe to work on. The first is a digital multimeter. I guess it doesn't have to be digital, but that's mostly what I recommend. This is actually a very inexpensive one from Amazon. It probably costs me, $20 or $30, and it works completely fine. You definitely want something that can measure resistance, AC. This one goes up to 600 volts AC, and then also DC, up to 600 volts DC. Some other features, you want it to be able to test continuity. Continuity means there is an electrical connection between two different places. If it can do all those things, this can help you ensure that your amp is safe to work on. Fundamentally speaking, you use the multimeter to test voltage. Again, you're going to stick one end on the negative lead. You're going to put the red lead on the positive lead and measure to see if a capacitor in question is storing voltage. I've got an amplifier that I'm working on right now. This is a JSIM 800 clone that I'm building and modifying. And, if you've never identified, or you have no idea what a filter capacitor is, typically they are large. So the filter caps are actually located right here, and there's a third one right there. They're large, cylindrical for the most part. I've got quite a few other filter caps in this bag. You can see, again, large, cylindrical types of things. On the side, there might be markings. Typically, one is for voltage. Maybe some in guitar amps, they tend to be maybe 450 or 500 volt type capacitors. And then there also is going to be a number that says UF after it. So UF stands for microfarad. That is the value of the capacitor, how much capacitance it has. And that value is usually somewhere between maybe as low as 8 microfarads. And then it could be all, 20, 30, 40, 50, and even could go up to 1 or 200 microfarads. And again, these are the filter caps. This amp was recently plugged in, so I'll just show you. I'm going to set it here, my multimeter, to DC volts 600. I'm going to take my black lead, and I'm going to connect it to my chassis, which is a ground. And then I'm going to take my red lead, and I'm going to attach it to the positive lead of my filter caps, which is this one. So it's reading 0 volts DC. I'm going to go to the next positive lead, 0 volts DC. I'm going to go to my last lead, 0 volts DC. Let's check this one over here on my screen grid, 0 volts DC. So I have just confirmed that these filter caps do not have any voltage present on them. This amp is safe to work on. I can touch it, and I don't have to have any fear that I'm going to hurt or injure myself. Now, let's say hypothetically that maybe you don't know if you're measuring the right caps, or you're not sure, or maybe you did measure them and there is a voltage present. How would you get rid of it? Well, my second tool is this. This is a capacitor bleeding tool, capacitor discharge tool. And basically what it does is it gives a path for that voltage to go to ground. So I'm going to take the black lead, again, clip it to the chassis, which is my ground source. And then I'm going to take the red lead, and all this is these two alligator clips for clipping on. And then in the middle, I have a resistor, which is tied in series. Meaning just that it slows down the flow of voltage. You could just take a screwdriver and connect the positive terminal of the capacitor to ground, and the voltage would flow. The problem with that, though, is it would flow very quickly, and it would cause a spark, and that would feel unsafe. So even though that would do the job, the resistor helps to slow the current down. I think this is a 1K 3-watt resistor in here. And again, if there was a voltage, I could simply connect the red here across the leads of this capacitor. Even if you're confused and don't even know where the chassis is, you can usually just go across the leads of the capacitor. Again, the capacitor is going to have a hot lead, it's going to have a ground lead. Now this is a multi-can cap, so it actually has 2 positive leads and 1 negative. But again, as long as the black is connected to ground, whether it's the negative terminal of the capacitor or the chassis itself, that's fine. And then the voltage that's present here is going to be bled through the clip, through the resistor, through the wire to ground. And then I could come back with my multimeter, stick it on DC volts again, stick it on that capacitor, and again confirm, okay, there's 0 volts, this amp is safe to work on. So in combination, the multimeter helps you to test and measure and read the voltage present, and then if you have a voltage present, you can use the discharge tool to get rid of it. The combination of these two tools will make sure that whenever you are working inside a tube amp, that you are doing so safely. Now, Another point to note is there are times where you may need to be taking measurements inside of a live operating tube amp. And so that can be a little scary. So a couple things to think about when you're doing that. Number one, whenever you have the power tubes in the amp, you need to have a load connected to the output transformer. So you need to have a speaker cable plugged into a speaker or some kind of other load on the speaker out. I always keep a speaker close by, and I've got a long speaker cable that I plug into the speaker jack of my amp to make sure that whenever I'm turning this puppy on, a load is being applied so that the output transformer does not get damaged. Number two, I recommend if you're going to be taking these kind of voltages, the type of leads that you work with, these are clip leads. So this one is a spring clip on the negative, and then this other one has kind of like a fishhook style, also with a spring clip. I don't know how well you guys can see that or not, but it basically means I can clip these leads wherever I want, and I can take a voltage without having to use my hands to touch anything. So I could have the amp off, I can apply my leads of my multimeter wherever I want them, I could turn the amp on, take my measurement readings, turn the amp off, and then reposition them. That's just a nice, safe way to do it. Now, multimeters often come with these kind of leads as well, ones that have a little probe, a little tip that you would have to hold by hand and press wherever you want to make your measurements. And though this is fine, I have many times used them to take measurements inside an amp, but I don't prefer that because sometimes while you're doing so and you're pressing, something can slip and you could accidentally touch your finger on some voltage that you don't want. So that's why I prefer these clip-on leads. I think that this is the most ideal kind, the one that has the little spring activated and it just grabs on with a little J-hook. That's my favorite kind. I recommend that. I think I got them on Amazon for $15 or $10, and I'll have a link in the description below. But that's what I recommend, just to be maximally safe. Now, if you are going to be using a lead that has a probe and you need to be holding it by hand, second thing to be aware of is really the primary way that you could really be damaged and injured is if you are taking your right hand and applying it to a high current, high voltage source like a filter cap, and then your left hand on the is contacting or touching ground in some way. What that means is now the high current source can flow from your right hand through your arms, through your chest, through your heart, and then to your left hand to ground. That is going to basically shock your heart with this voltage and could cause your rhythm to be messed up. Now, that's as much explanation as I'm going to give because I'm not a medical professional and I don't even fully understand all of that I just said. But again, if you have a path to ground, whether it's by your offhand or whether it's by your feet, what you're standing on, if you touch a voltage or a high current source with one hand and it travels through your heart on its way to ground, that can cause a lot of injury. So one thing that you can always choose to do is take one hand, put it behind your back, and then take your other hand with your lead and use that to press where it needs to be pressed. You never want to be having if I have my right hand on this lead and then I also have my left hand maybe just kind of passively here holding or touching the chassis, that is a recipe for problem. So always keep one hand behind your back. The last thing to note is you want to make sure that your work area is nicely secured. So right now I've got this chassis set up on this wooden amp cradle kind of setup that I've put together. This is certain and stable and secure, and it's not floating around, and so you want to make sure that things are stable. And with all of those tips and thoughts, you should be pretty capable of maintaining good safety so that you can walk away from this experience alive and healthy to show for it. Okay, so next let's talk about what kind of tools that you're going to need. I've already talked about a couple of them, but let's expand on that. So again, let's start with a multimeter. This is, again, a cheap one that I've used. I've used decent ones. I've used cheap ones. If you get a nice multimeter, you're probably going to need to buy once, cry once is a good situation there. With these cheap ones, they tend to last me a few years. Then something goes wrong and they break, and then I buy a new one. I really haven't had a big problem with these cheapies from China. They've worked just fine. Again, as I said before, you really want them to be able to measure resistance, AC voltage, DC voltage, and then also have the ability to measure for continuity. If it can do those things, you're going to be in a pretty good spot. And then again, I also recommend, like I said, those leads that I recommended before with the spring-loaded clips. That digital multimeter is going to be a great step. A general purpose screwdriver set is really nice. Some various types of tools is really nice. Needle nose pliers I use a ton. Also got more of a flat build one here that I use. I've got a wire stripper. Now, wire stripper, this one goes from 10 gauge to 22 gauge. I also kind of like having one that could go even a little bit smaller, till maybe 24 or 26 gauge wire, just for some thinner wires. But this one works really good. It's got both a flat cutting area to cut off wire completely, and then it's got these holes where you can remove the sheathing around your wire. Also, just a general clipper is really nice to have too. Another luxury element that I would recommend is this. It's called a third hand. It's just something that you can put components in, clip them into the jaws of this device, so it kind of gives you something to hold on to. Bit of a luxury. I have built many amps without it, but now that I've got one, I really like it. Another luxury device that I use sometimes is this. This is like a component tester that I bought. I think I got it years ago, actually. It was really cheap, but like this does things like you can put capacitors or transistors or things like that in here, and it will give you measurements that the multimeter can't necessarily complete. I also usually keep an electric drill on hand for other things that I need to take apart. Got my discharge tool. Then lastly, we come to the big mamas here. I've got a soldering station, and I've got my solder. Now, regarding the soldering station, I would not recommend one of like the gun style irons. Those are just too much, and they're too heavy for this purpose. I recommend one where you can get more of this pencil style tip. Now, this is a Weller. This is not super high-end or fancy or anything, but this soldering iron does have a dial here where I can go 1 through 5 and adjust the heat. I find that to be really nice. Having some ability to adjust heat on your soldering iron is really good. I have used, again, really, really cheap soldering irons. They tend to wear out a little more quickly. They're not going to last you for a long time. Again, buy once, cry once applies here. But you really don't need to spend several $100s on a soldering iron to get started. I just would say you want one that can at least get hot enough to heat up the ground on a chassis. Not necessarily like solder something to a huge steel chassis, but at least when you're soldering ground connections, you need to be able to get it hot enough that it flows properly. So again, having some ability to control your heat is just what I would recommend there. Then this one also has an interchangeable tip, so I can actually remove the screw here and take the tip off and put a different one on. This one has kind of a 45-degree slanted pencil tip, which I really like. I don't prefer the pointed tips as much. I like one that have maybe a chisel edge or a 45-degree slant. Works really well for me. Then this is just a pool of solder that I got off of Amazon. This is 6337 rosin core solder. This works really nicely. It's relatively thin, which in diameter, if I find sometimes if the solder is too thick, it flows too heavy. You want to be able to control it, so that one works really well for me. I also have a desoldering pump, which if you make a mistake, you can press this in, put it on the area, and press this button. It sucks that solder out. You can also buy desoldering wick, but I find that this pump works really nicely and recommend it. Then lastly, you want to probably have some kind of wire. I find when building amps, I really like having different colors so I can kind of color code things and stay a little more organized. Then, as far as gauge, I find 22 gauge works really well for like all of the audio signal. And then if you want to have like a 20 or an 18 gauge for the thicker stuff like the power supply, that also works really well. But I tend to build with, there's solid core wire and then there's stranded core wire. I like stranded core wire because it's a little bit more robust. The solid core can be a little brittle But the solid core is nice because it holds and retains its shape. So I actually find it's nice to actually have some of both and use both in different situations. When you use the solid core, you can really put it exactly where you want it. So if you know what you're doing, that can be really nice. But I find for a beginner, I probably would go more with the stranded core because it's a little more forgiving. Then lastly, I bought a run of shielded cable on eBay for pretty cheap. It was maybe $10 or so, and I really am glad that I did. Having some shielded cable can be really nice, and find that I am using it quite often, and it works really well. So just for areas if you want to keep the noise down, that helps a lot. So I recommend that. Some other little miscellaneous bobs and bits. I like to have set a pack of screws and washers and nuts just to help get things tied down, and I tend to use that pretty often as I'm building things miscellaneous. Then, there's a lot of other parts and hardware. Now, when you're starting off, you're probably going to be focusing more on like building to a specific circuit or schematic or kit. But as I've gotten older, I have tended to kind of amass a bunch of parts. And so, for example, this is just a little bit of my collection, but I've got this box of assortment of values of resistors. These are all quarter watt resistors, and all the way from 1 ohm up to like 10 mega ohm. And I find with my builds, it's really nice to have an assortment of values. And if you want to experiment with, instead of a 1.5K bias resistor, if you want to try a 3K, you have some flexibility here. But when you're a beginner starting out, you are going to be focusing much more on just building to spec, and maybe you're building out of a kit. But, if for my money, having a big pack like this is really nice in the long run and gives you more options if you're going to be building and modifying, having that pack is really nice. Same thing here. One thing I tend to do, like with pots, whenever I'm going to, there's some very commonly used pots, like a 1 mega ohm audio taper pot. So whenever I'm running low, I find that, if I've got a build coming up that requires 2 pots of that specification, then I will probably just buy 5 or 6. So I just have a little bit extra to kind of build up my stash for when I want them. And then same thing with capacitors. I've got kind of an assortment of caps. I think I did a little bit of the mass in terms of the ceramic disc caps, but then for like electrolytic caps, I kind of build up a little bit of a stock of supply and just try to keep some on hand so that I have some flexibility when I'm building. And just over time, I build up some supply and try to keep them. I have some flexibility with my building. Okay, so you made it this far. You'd like to move forward. What kind of project would I recommend that you dive into? That's an interesting question. For me, I got into building guitar amps in part because I'm also a guitar player. So for me, I wanted to build an amplifier that I wanted to play. So it needed to fit your style of music, and that's a very open-ended question, very much dependent on, are you trying to play Guns N' Roses or country or blues or funk or heavy metal or anything in between. So it's a little bit of a challenging question to answer. However, I do think from a beginner's perspective, there is a bit of a progression that I would recommend that most people would follow, and it would be as such. So if you have never had any experience with electronics, with soldering, if all this stuff is completely new and fresh to you, I probably would not recommend an amplifier for your first project. As a training wheels project, I instead would actually recommend that you probably try and build a guitar pedal, something like a simple boost pedal, like an electroharmonics type boost, a pedal kit where you might spend less than $100 on a pedal kit. It comes in the mail. It's just going to be a lot more low intensity, there's much less that you can screw up. You're much likely to work out some of the kinks in terms of like how to actually use your soldering iron, how hot to get the tip, how much solder to flow, how to get components to work together, and even just thinking about like how to run wires and follow wiring diagrams. Just again, as a training wheels exercise to get the ball rolling. A pedal is so much easier to do than a guitar amp. If it goes wrong and you never even get it up and running, you're not out a ton of money, and maybe you discover this is not for me and I really can't wrap my brain around this, and it goes poorly, and then instead of sinking several hundred or $1,000 into a project, you're maybe $70 into a project, and it's easier to just exit at that point. But if you do succeed and get an up and running pedal, that'll still probably be useful. I bet a lot of you that play guitar have pedals, so it's still useful towards that end. So again, start with a pedal kit. Let's say you've got a little bit of that under your belt, you're feeling confident, you're feeling willing to be a little more committed, then I would dive into building a guitar amp. The main one that I would recommend is a Fender 5E3 Tweed Deluxe, and there's a couple reasons for that. Number one, I think the 5E3 is a very simple amplifier to build. It doesn't have a ton of parts. It doesn't have a lot of complexity to it. It's easy to build. It's got an easy layout to follow, among the lowest of difficulties and good for a beginner. Number two, the 5E3 is one of the most popular build amplifiers amongst people like myself. Almost everybody that has built amps has built a 5E3 at one point in their life. So if you run into a problem and you need to bring it to somebody, a lot of people have familiarity with the circuit. They're familiar with how the parts are laid out on an eyelet board, or even if you had to follow a PCB, the circuit is well known, so it's easier to get help in troubleshooting it. Another reason I recommend it is availability of parts and kits and components. There is a lot of variance in the type of project that you could do, all the way from ordering a full-on kit that comes with like a finished cabinet and speaker and tubes and transformers and all the other miscellaneous bits that would go into a functioning combo amplifier, all the way scaled down to like a small parts kit where you're just getting like the circuit board and the resistors and the capacitors, but then you are going to be responsible for maybe building a chassis, for sourcing your own transformers. Maybe you want to build a head instead of a combo, and so you don't need a speaker, or you're a woodworker and you want to build your own enclosure. The 5E3 really allows for that, for you to find the project that fits your budget and your desires really, really well. Lastly, a 5E3 is a really nice amp. It sits at about 15 watts of output power, and so in my opinion, it scales better throughout the life of your guitar playing. It can keep up and be used in a live situation with a drummer. There's also a ton of circuit modifications that you can make to it. I've got several videos on mods. I have modded the heck out of my 5E3. And even just some basic mods like adding negative feedback or maybe adding a tone stack, you can really get this thing, you can have the stock default tweed voicing, which is very mid-rangey, great overdrive. But with those two mods I mentioned, you can clean it up, give more of a black panel, clean sound, and have a very versatile, good-sounding amp for a variety of styles all in one box. And so it really will scale well into your amp building career. Another option that people commonly would recommend would be a 5F1 Champ. The 5F1 Champ is better than the 5E3 because it's simpler. It only has one output tube instead of two. It really only has like one preamp path, whereas the Tweed Deluxe has two parallel preamp paths. So the 5E3 is a little bit more complicated, just a little, than the Champ. But to me, the Champ being 5 watts just means it's quite a bit more limited in what you can do with it. It's really much like a one-trick pony that's pretty much just useful for playing at home in your bedroom if you want kind of a very simple, basic tube amp sound without a lot of tone control or flexibility or scalability. It just is quite a bit narrower, I think, and it's something that you might outgrow and not use as much, whereas the 5E3 is pretty much always going to be relevant and something that you could play and use. I probably wouldn't recommend one of the black panel Fenders like a Deluxe Reverb or a Princeton Reverb, because go figure, they come with usually reverb and tremolo circuits. So you're adding a fair bit more parts count, complexity, ways things can go wrong, things can add noise. You want to kind of get a little bit of more of a layup with a lower difficulty level when you're getting started. Also, there's some Marshall or some higher gain circuits. I, again, would probably save those maybe for your second project, just because, again, going to have a little more tubes, a little bit more wire runs, maybe higher output wattages, and just, again, a little bit higher complexity. So, and also the last part is maybe not as widely built as the 5E3. So not as many options in terms of kits, or not as many people that have built those circuits that are real familiar with them to give you help if you need it. So again, the 5E3 is really, I think, the sweet spot and the one I would recommend for you guys to start with. Then the last section I want to talk about is resources for further learning. Let's say you decide you're going to build a 5E3 and you've got the tools and you've got the discharge tools that I mentioned, all that stuff, you're ready to go. A lot of that initial process is going to be more of a Bob Ross paint by numbers approach, where it's, there's going to be some instructions, and it's okay, put this component here, and you're following a paint by numbers approach, which is good and necessary. But you also want to try to increase your knowledge and your understanding to reveal the why of what's going on underneath the paint by numbers, so that you can understand these circuits, understand what each component is doing in the circuit, and figure out on a deeper level what's going on. The best way that I would recommend do that would be the following. Number one, I would point you to Rob Robinette's website. He's got a ton of articles about a lot of common tube amp projects, about how tube amp circuits work. He's got really well laid out diagrams and schematics, and it's just a great way to, just something as simple as seeing the signal flow through a tube amp schematic, or an explanation of what a rectifier is and how it functions, or what this plate load resistor does. There's all of those different types of things. His website is awesome for that. Highly recommend that. Number two, I would point you to a guy named the Valve Wizard. He's got a website. His name is Merlin Blenko, and he also has a book. If you would prefer a paper copy, more old school, it's a guide to designing guitar and bass preamps. I own that book, and I have referred to it often. It really is, again, kind of a Bible for building guitar amplifiers. A third resource I would recommend would be Uncle Doug's YouTube channel. That was one that really stuck out to me. I really like watching videos, and he's got hundreds of videos. Honestly, a great education would be literally going back to his old catalog and just watching one after another, and seeing him build these videos. For example, if you want to start with a 5F1 champ, I know he's got a video on a 5F1 champ, and he maybe did some modifications to it too. So it's just a more helpful visual presentation of how to build amps. And then he's got it all the way scaled up to custom building an amp step by step, with doing a DIYing every detail of the process and the procedure there. So really, between those three, Rob Robinette, Merlin Blenko, and Uncle Doug, I think there's a huge volume of resources to draw on. And hopefully this video can help you in that process as well. So I hope that kind of gives you a little better clarity and direction on how to get started. This is a hobby that I have really come to love and enjoy, and there is the safety concerns. You do need to be cautious and careful, and you always need to be mindful of staying safe. But I also genuinely want to share and broaden and grow the hobby. I would love for people to find the joy in it that I have found, and to be out there building really cool guitar amps that you're playing or selling, and just continue the beauty and the treasure of a handmade, custom-built tube amp. There really is no experience quite like that, in my opinion. And also just it's such a cool technology, and it really is kind of a dated, archaic thing at this point. So the guitar world is really probably the best place to continue a love of tube amplifier design moving forward in the future. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave me your thoughts down in the comment section below. I will have links to pretty much everything that's mentioned, follow-up videos for deeper discussion on things. So please check it out in the comment section below. Subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll see you again soon. Thanks. Bye.